You ever find yourself in a moment so surreal, you wonder if you're the main character in someone's bad sitcom? That's how I felt sitting in that courtroom, staring at Sophia's smug face. I'd braced myself for the usual jabs, the "you never did enough," or "I was the only one trying." But what came out of her mouth was a masterpiece of cruelty. "You're like a workhorse, Ryan. Easy to ride, but absolutely useless in the long run." The courtroom actually chuckled. I could feel the heat rising in my neck, spreading to my ears, and settling somewhere in my chest like a lit furnace. My fists clenched under the table, my nails digging into my palms, but I didn't flinch. She wanted a reaction, and I wasn't about to give it to her. See, Sophia always had a knack for cutting deep, for twisting the knife just right. It wasn't enough to leave the marriage. She had to take my dignity with her. That comment, "workhorse," wasn't just an insult. It was a summary of how she'd seen me for years, despite everything I'd done. I worked 2 jobs for a while, trying to keep up with her lifestyle. I skipped nights out, didn't upgrade my car, and wore the same tired suit for 3 years because Sophia needed the latest of everything. And now I was a workhorse. I scanned the room. Her lawyer smirked. The judge's face remained impassive. The gallery? They were entertained. To them, this was a midday drama, something to discuss over lunch. But to me, this was 6 years of my life boiled down to a punchline. What hurt wasn't just the words. It was that they laughed. I'd spent years thinking I was building something with Sophia, only to realize she'd been watching from the sidelines, waiting to find the next best thing. It wasn't just her betrayal. It was her mockery of the man I'd been while I was with her. When the judge called for a short recess, I took the opportunity to step out. The walls of the courtroom felt like they were closing in, and I needed to breathe. Outside, I leaned against the cool stone pillar and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, I let myself feel the weight of it all. The humiliation, the anger, the sheer disbelief that someone I'd loved so deeply could strip me down so mercilessly. And yet, there was a part of me that found it oddly liberating. I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out. Sophia had finally said out loud what she'd probably been thinking for years. The gloves were off, and I didn't have to pretend anymore. No more walking on eggshells, no more second-guessing myself, and no more trying to fix something that had been broken for a long, long time. I straightened up and looked at my reflection in a nearby window. I didn't see a workhorse. I saw someone who was tired but still standing. Someone who had more strength than Sophia had ever given him credit for. And as I adjusted my tie and prepared to go back in, I made a decision. If Sophia wanted a show, I'd give her one. But it wouldn't be the kind she was expecting. You know what's funny? You can look back at your own life and pinpoint all the moments you should have seen it coming. I stood in that courtroom, letting Sophia's words roll off me like water, but inside my head, I was rifling through years of memories. The signs were all there. I just didn't want to see them. When we first met, Sophia had this energy about her. She walked into a room, and everyone noticed. She was elegant, confident, and had this magnetic laugh that made people want to stay just a little longer. I wasn't immune. I was smitten. When she said yes to my awkward dinner invitation, I thought I'd won the lottery. The first year of marriage? It was great, at least, that's what I told myself. We traveled, we laughed, and we dreamed big. I wanted a life with her. She wanted a life that looked good on Instagram, but I didn't see the difference then. I thought I could give her everything she wanted if I just worked hard enough. So, I worked. Boy, did I work. Early mornings, late nights, skipped weekends. I poured every ounce of energy into providing for her. She wanted the condo downtown? I found a way to make it happen. She wanted designer handbags? Sure, I tightened my belt. When she decided she was too good for her office job and wanted to pursue her passions, I supported her without question. But here's the thing. I don't think Sophia ever saw me as her partner. To her, I was a stepping stone, a way to get to where she wanted to be. She didn't see the sacrifices I made, the things I gave up. All she saw was the result, the condo, the handbags, the nice dinners. And when the novelty wore off, so did her affection. Looking back, I can't pinpoint the exact moment she started to drift away. Maybe it was the first time she came home late without an explanation. Maybe it was the weekend trips she started taking with her friends. Maybe it was the way she'd roll her eyes when I asked how her day was. But there was one moment I'll never forget. It was our 3rd anniversary. I'd planned this whole evening, dinner at the restaurant where we had our first date, followed by a surprise weekend getaway. I'd saved for months. When I told her about it, her response was, "That's it? That's it?" 3 years of love, effort, and devotion boiled down to 2 words that gutted me. Of course, I didn't say anything. I laughed it off, told her I'd try harder next year. That's what I did back then. I excused her. I excused the growing distance, the dismissive tone, the way she'd started prioritizing her social media over our conversations. I didn't want to admit that the woman I married was changing. Or maybe she'd always been this way, and I was just starting to see it. But the real kicker came a year later when I stumbled across a receipt for a piece of jewelry I didn't recognize. It wasn't for me. She didn't even bother to hide it. When I confronted her, she laughed and said, "It's just a gift for a friend." A friend. Right. I should have walked away then. I should have packed my things and left. But I didn't. I told myself I could fix it, that if I just worked a little harder, loved her a little more, I could bring her back. What a fool I was. By the time I realized the truth, it was too late. She was already 1 foot out the door, her sights set on someone else, Benjamin, the wealthy investor, with a sports car and a villa in the hills. She thought he was her ticket to the life she deserved. Standing in that courtroom, I could see it so clearly. I'd been nothing more than a stepping stone for Sophia, a means to an end. And now that she thought she was done with me, she didn't even have the decency to leave quietly. But she underestimated me. She thought I'd crumble under her insults, that I'd let her walk away with everything I'd worked for. What she didn't realize was that the years of being dismissed, disrespected, and undervalued had forged something in me she didn't expect. Strength. She wanted to tear me down, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Not now. Not ever. When the judge called us back in, I took a deep breath and stepped into that courtroom, not as the man Sophia thought she could destroy, but as the man who was ready to reclaim his story. The judge asked Sophia's lawyer to present their arguments, and of course, they started with the same tired script. I was lazy, uninspired, and a burden in the marriage. The workhorse comment got thrown in again, followed by a smug glance from Sophia. She leaned back in her chair like she'd already won. But here's the thing about underestimating someone. It always backfires. When my lawyer, Claire, stood to speak, I felt a calm settle over me. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Claire started by dismantling their narrative, point by point, using facts to paint a very different picture. Bank statements, receipts, and records of my long hours and sacrifices. All of it laid bare for the court to see. But the real moment came when Claire turned to me and said, "Ryan, would you like to address the court?" This was my chance. I stood up, adjusted my tie, and walked to the center of the room. My palms were sweating, but my resolve was solid. Sophia called me a workhorse. I began, my voice steady. And I suppose she's not entirely wrong. I worked hard, harder than she'll ever know, to build the life we shared. But what she won't tell you is that the sacrifices I made were never for me. They were for us. For her. I paused, scanning the room. The gallery was silent, their earlier chuckles replaced with rapt attention. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. "Since Sophia enjoys metaphors, let me give you one of my own," I continued. "Yes, I'm a workhorse. But not because I'm weak or expendable. It's because I carry weight, real weight, and I never faltered, no matter how heavy it got." Then, I did something that caught everyone off guard. I took off my suit jacket, unbuttoned my shirt, and slid it off my shoulders. The collective gasp that filled the room was almost cinematic. My torso was a map of scars and calluses, each one telling a story. Years of manual labor, long shifts, and sacrifices etched into my skin. These were the marks of someone who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. "This," I said, gesturing to the scars, "is what being a workhorse looks like." While Sophia was busy spending money on things she didn't need, I was out there making sure she had them. And yet, she stands here today and mocks me as if I've done nothing. I turned to face her, locking eyes with her for the first time. Her smug expression was gone, replaced with something I'd never seen before. Shame. Here's the truth Sophia doesn't want you to know, I said, my voice rising. The reason we had a condo downtown? My overtime hours. The vacation she bragged about on social media? My savings. The freedom she enjoyed while I worked 2 jobs? My sacrifice. And now, she wants to strip me of everything I have left, as if I'm nothing more than an obstacle in her path to a new life. I could feel the room shifting. The gallery wasn't laughing anymore. They were listening. But here's the thing, I said, my voice firm. I'm not an obstacle. I'm a survivor. And I won't let anyone, not even the woman I once loved, take away what I've built. I turned to the judge, who was watching me with an unreadable expression. That's all I have to say, I finished, buttoning up my shirt and walking back to my seat. The rest of the session was a blur. Sophia's lawyer fumbled, trying to regain their footing, but it was clear the damage had been done. Sophia herself sat frozen, her earlier confidence shattered. When the judge called for another recess, Claire turned to me and whispered, "That was brilliant." I didn't feel brilliant. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but I also felt something else, free. For the first time in years, I'd spoken my truth, and it felt damn good. Sophia thought she could control the narrative, but she forgot one crucial detail. The truth doesn't stay buried forever. You could practically hear a pin drop when the judge called the courtroom back into session. Sophia's lawyers shuffled their papers, clearly rattled. The smug confidence they'd walked in with earlier had melted away. Sophia, too, sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers drumming anxiously on the table. The courtroom laughter from before was a distant memory. And me? I sat there, calm, arms folded, watching them scramble to pick up the pieces. For years, I'd been on the defensive in our marriage, always trying to make things right, always feeling like I wasn't enough. But this time, I wasn't playing their game. This time, I was the one in control. Claire, my lawyer, didn't waste a second. She stood up, her voice sharp and confident. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that directly contradicts the narrative the opposing counsel has attempted to construct." She handed a thick stack of documents to the judge. Bank statements, expense reports, receipts, all of it meticulously organized and highlighted. I'd spent weeks digging through every account, every bill, and every piece of paperwork to make sure we had it all. "Here we have a clear record of Mr. Ryan's financial contributions to the marriage," Claire continued. "He paid the mortgage, covered household expenses, and even funded Sophia's personal ventures, expenses she conveniently omitted from her testimony." The judge flipped through the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. Claire wasn't done. "Additionally, Your Honor, we have evidence that Mrs. Sophia diverted funds from their joint account to a private account she kept hidden from Mr. Ryan. These funds were used to finance her personal lifestyle, including extravagant vacations and purchases unrelated to the marriage." That was when the color started draining from Sophia's face. "And finally," Claire said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "we have proof of Mrs. Sophia's infidelity." At that, Sophia's lawyers shot to their feet. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the case." The judge raised a hand, silencing them. "Continue, Miss Claire." Claire nodded and handed over another folder. Photos, hotel receipts, and correspondence between Mrs. Sophia and her lover, Benjamin. The affair wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a financial one. Mrs. Sophia used joint marital funds to support this extramarital relationship. Sophia's lawyers slumped back into their seat. The fight had left them. Sophia, on the other hand, looked like she wanted to vanish into thin air. Her face was pale, her hands clenched in her lap. I could see her biting the inside of her cheek, trying to keep her composure, but the cracks were showing. The judge looked up from the folder, his gaze heavy. "Mrs. Sophia, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For once, she had nothing to say. I'll admit, watching her squirm wasn't as satisfying as I thought it would be. It didn't erase the years of pain or the nights I'd spent wondering what I'd done wrong. But it did give me something I hadn't felt in a long time. Vindication. Sophia's lawyer tried to recover, offering weak rebuttals and excuses, but it was clear they were fighting a losing battle. The evidence was overwhelming, and the judge wasn't buying their attempts to shift the blame. As the session came to a close, the judge announced that a decision would be made soon. He gave Sophia a pointed look. "Mrs. Sophia, I suggest you reflect on your actions and their consequences before we reconvene." She nodded silently, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, anger, sadness. It all swirled together in a way I couldn't quite process. But as I stepped into the fresh air outside, one thought stood out above the rest. For the first time in years, the truth was on my side. When we returned to court the next day, the air felt different. It was heavier, like everyone in the room knew something monumental was about to happen. Sophia sat at her table, her posture stiff, her eyes avoiding mine. Her lawyer whispered furiously in her ear, gesturing to the pile of evidence Claire had submitted the previous day. Me? I sat there, calm and collected, even if my insides were churning with anticipation. This wasn't just about the money or the divorce anymore. It was about my dignity, my story. And I was ready to make sure everyone in that room understood exactly who they were dealing with. The judge began with a recap, laying out the evidence Claire had presented. "It is clear that there were significant contributions made by Mr. Ryan to the marriage, both financial and otherwise," he stated, his voice steady but firm. I glanced at Sophia. Her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "Good. Let her feel the weight of this." Claire stood, her voice calm, but with an edge of steel. "Your Honor, my client has been painted as a failure in this marriage, a so-called workhorse who contributed little. The evidence, however, tells a very different story. Mr. Ryan not only carried the financial burden, but also supported Mrs. Sophia in her personal endeavors, often at great personal cost. The narrative presented by the opposing counsel is not only false, it is insulting." The judge nodded, motioning for Sophia's lawyer to respond. "Your Honor," her lawyer began, "we acknowledge the financial contributions made by Mr. Ryan. However, we maintain that the emotional climate of the marriage was detrimental to Mrs. Sophia's well-being, and this, combined with Mr. Ryan's alleged neglect, led to the breakdown of the relationship." Alleged neglect. That one stung. Claire didn't miss a beat. "If we're speaking of neglect, Your Honor, let's not overlook the documented evidence of Mrs. Sophia's actions, specifically, her diversion of funds and her extramarital relationship. Emotional climate aside, the financial and personal betrayals committed by Mrs. Sophia significantly contributed to the breakdown of this marriage. The tension in the room was palpable. Even Sophia's lawyer looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Then, the judge did something I wasn't expecting. "Mr. Ryan," he said, turning his attention to me, "you've been accused of neglect in this marriage. Is there anything you'd like to say in response?" I stood up, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Your Honor, neglect is a strong word. I may not have been perfect, but I gave everything I had to this marriage. I worked long hours to provide for us, not because I wanted to be away from Sophia, but because I believed in building a life together. I wasn't the one who spent weekends with someone else while my spouse thought I was working late. I wasn't the one who siphoned money from our joint account to fund a secret life. And I certainly wasn't the one who decided that my partner was disposable." I paused, letting my words sink in. Sophia looked down at her hands, her face unreadable. "The truth is," I continued, "I loved Sophia. I loved her enough to sacrifice my own happiness for hers. But love isn't enough when it's one-sided. And no matter how much I gave, it was never going to be enough for her. That's not neglect, that's reality." The courtroom was silent. Even the gallery, which had been buzzing with murmurs earlier, seemed to be holding its breath. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Ryan. You may sit." As I returned to my seat, Claire gave me a small nod of approval. The rest of the session was a blur of legal jargon and procedural motions, but I could feel the shift. The balance of power had tipped, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, it wasn't in Sophia's favor. When the judge called for an adjournment, he turned to Sophia. "Mrs. Sophia, the evidence against you is compelling. I would advise you to carefully consider your next steps before we reconvene." Her face was a mix of anger and fear as she nodded stiffly. As we left the courtroom, Claire turned to me with a rare smile. "You've got them on the ropes," she said. I nodded, but I didn't let myself celebrate just yet. There was still work to be done, still a decision to be made. But for the first time, I felt like I was winning. And that felt pretty damn good. The day Sophia's carefully crafted facade crumbled completely wasn't some grand, dramatic showdown. It was quieter, more devastating, and infinitely more satisfying. The courtroom felt unusually charged when the session resumed. Sophia's lawyer had clearly spent the night scrambling to salvage their case. They shuffled papers, whispered furiously with her, and occasionally shot me in Claire glares that could have melted steel. I sat back, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. Sophia, for all her usual poise, was visibly unraveling. Her makeup was flawless, as always, but her posture betrayed her. She sat hunched, her eyes darting nervously to the judge, to me, and even to the gallery behind us. The woman who had mocked me with the workhorse comment just days ago now looked like someone walking a tightrope over an abyss. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. He wasted no time. "Before we proceed further, I have reviewed the evidence submitted by the plaintiff, including financial records, correspondence, and testimony from third parties. It is clear that Mrs. Sophia has engaged in behavior detrimental to the integrity of this marriage." Sophia's head snapped up, her lawyer's whispered warning clearly ignored. The judge wasn't done. "This includes but is not limited to siphoning funds from a joint account, engaging in extramarital affairs, and attempting to misrepresent Mr. Ryan's contributions during these proceedings." You could have heard a pin drop. Sophia's face was pale, her lips trembling as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. "Mrs. Sophia," the judge continued, his tone stern, "your actions not only undermine your claims but also paint a picture of significant misconduct on your part. This court does not look kindly upon such behavior." And there it was, the moment her carefully curated image shattered. The gallery was buzzing with whispers. Even Sophia's lawyer looked like they wanted to sink through the floor. But the best part? I hadn't even needed to lift a finger. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Ryan, given the evidence presented, this court finds your claims of financial and emotional exploitation to be credible. Furthermore, you have demonstrated remarkable composure and integrity throughout these proceedings." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral, but inside, I felt a surge of vindication. Years of being belittled, of questioning my worth, of feeling like I wasn't enough. It all came rushing back, only to be replaced by something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. The next few minutes were a blur of legal formalities. The judge outlined the financial penalties Sophia would face, including restitution of the funds she'd stolen and a significant portion of the marital assets being awarded to me. And then came the final blow. "Mrs. Sophia," the judge said, leaning forward slightly, "this court recognizes the harm your actions have caused not only to Mr. Ryan but also to the integrity of this union. I would advise you to reflect deeply on the choices that brought you to this point." Sophia looked like she might cry, but she didn't. Instead, she sat there, shoulders slumped, her once unshakable confidence reduced to ashes. As the judge adjourned the session, Sophia's lawyer turned to her, speaking in hushed tones. I caught snippets of the conversation, words like reputation and damage control. She didn't look at me as I gathered my things to leave, but as I walked past her table, I couldn't resist stopping. I leaned in, just enough for her to hear me. "Workhorse, huh?" I said, my voice low and calm. "Looks like this workhorse just lapped you." She didn't respond, didn't even lift her head. For the first time, she had no words. As I walked out of the courtroom, Claire caught up with me, a rare grin on her face. "You should have seen her expression when the judge listed the penalties," she said. I laughed, a real, genuine laugh. For the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't carrying the weight of her mockery, her manipulation, or her betrayal. I was free. Outside, the air was crisp, the sun shining brighter than it had in months. I paused on the steps of the courthouse, taking it all in. Sophia thought she could humiliate me, break me, and walk away with everything I'd worked for. Instead, She was the one walking away empty-handed, her mask torn off for everyone to see. And me? I was just getting started. Walking out of that courthouse felt like shedding a heavy coat in the middle of a heat wave. For the first time in years, I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. The sting of Sophia's betrayal was still there, but it wasn't the sharp pain it had been. Now, it felt like a bruise, tender but healing. Claire walked beside me, going over the next steps in the divorce process, but honestly, I wasn't listening. My mind was already ahead, thinking about what my life could look like without Sophia in it. For years, my world had revolved around her needs, her wants, her endless demands. Now, I had the chance to ask myself, what do I want? That question lingered in my mind as I started rebuilding. The first step was simple but symbolic. I cleared out every trace of Sophia from my life. Her clothes, her shoes, the ridiculous decor she insisted on buying. All of it went into boxes. It was strange, watching the space transform as I reclaimed it. The living room felt bigger without her oversized furniture. The walls felt brighter without her pretentious art pieces. For the first time, the apartment felt like mine. I kept a few things, though. The practical stuff. Dishes, towels, furniture that actually served a purpose. But the rest? I donated it or tossed it without a second thought. I didn't want any reminders of the life we'd built, or more accurately, the life I'd carried while she decorated. My second step was even more personal. I dug through my closet and found my old sketchbook, the one I hadn't touched in years. Back before the overtime hours, before the endless demands of Sophia's lifestyle, I used to draw. Nothing fancy, just landscapes and cityscapes I'd see on my way to work. It was my way of relaxing, of letting my mind wander. Sophia had laughed at it once, calling it a childish hobby. I remember the way her voice dripped with condescension as she asked, "Why waste time on something that doesn't make money?" I'd put the sketchbook away after that. But now I opened it up and started drawing again. At first, my lines were shaky, my hand unsteady from years of neglect. But as the days passed, the muscle memory came back. Each sketch felt like reclaiming a part of myself Sophia had tried to bury. I also reconnected with old friends, the ones I drifted away from during my marriage. It was humbling to admit how isolated I'd become, but their responses were nothing but supportive. One friend, Jake, invited me out for a drink and said, "We were waiting for you to wake up, man. You deserve better than what she gave you." Those nights out, those conversations, they reminded me of who I used to be before I became Sophia's husband. I wasn't just the guy who worked late and paid the bills. I was Ryan, the friend, the artist, the guy who loved bad movies and long hikes. Work became easier, too. Without Sophia draining me emotionally and financially, I had more energy to focus on my career. My boss noticed the change and even commented on how productive I'd become. It felt good to be recognized for something other than my ability to endure. And then, there was the gym. I hadn't realized how much stress I'd been carrying until I started lifting weights again. Every rep, every mile on the treadmill, felt like I was exorcising the ghosts of my marriage. My body changed quickly. Years of manual labor had given me a solid foundation, and it didn't take long for the results to show. I didn't do it to spite Sophia, though I'd be lying if I said the thought of her seeing me now didn't bring a little satisfaction. I did it for me, to feel strong again, to remind myself that I wasn't just a workhorse. One night, as I stood in front of the mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back at me, not just because of the physical changes, but because of the confidence in his eyes. I wasn't the same Ryan who'd walked into that courtroom weeks ago, burdened by years of Sophia's insults and manipulation. I was someone new. Someone better. The final step in my redemption was forgiveness, not for Sophia, but for myself. For years, I'd blamed myself for the failures in our marriage, for not being enough, for not seeing the signs sooner. But standing in my reclaimed apartment, surrounded by the life I was rebuilding, I realized something important. I wasn't the problem. Sophia's betrayal wasn't about me. It was about her greed, her selfishness, her inability to appreciate what she had. And once I understood that, I stopped carrying the guilt. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I was free. The final court session wasn't the cinematic climax you'd expect. There were no explosive arguments, no tears, or dramatic confessions. Instead, it was clinical, procedural, and eerily quiet. I think that's what made it more impactful. Sophia wasn't the firebrand she'd been in earlier hearings. She didn't mock me or hurl insults. She just sat there, subdued, her face a mask of resignation. The judge read out the final decision, his tone firm but impartial. This court recognizes that Mr. Ryan has provided ample evidence of financial and emotional contributions during the marriage, while Mrs. Sophia's actions have demonstrated significant misconduct. As such, the marital assets will be divided in favor of Mr. Ryan, who will retain the apartment, as well as restitution for funds taken without his consent. I kept my eyes forward, not daring to glance at Sophia. I didn't want to see her reaction. Not yet. The judge continued. This court also orders the dissolution of the marriage between Mr. Ryan and Mrs. Sophia. The divorce is finalized as of today. Both parties are advised to move forward amicably and respectfully. And just like that, it was over. When the judge dismissed us, I stood, my legs feeling heavier than they should have. I grabbed my briefcase and turned to leave, but then something stopped me. Maybe it was the finality of the moment, or maybe it was the sense that I needed to close this chapter properly for my own peace of mind. I turned back to Sophia. She was still seated, staring at the table in front of her. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Sophia, I said, my voice low but steady. She looked up, her eyes searching mine. For a second, I saw a flicker of something. Regret, maybe, or realization. What? She asked, her voice soft, almost defeated. I just wanted to say goodbye, I said. Not because I owe you anything, but because I need to. This is the last time we'll see each other, and I want you to know something. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. I don't hate you, I continued. I thought I would. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life hating you for everything you did. For the lies, the betrayal, the way you made me feel like I was never enough. But I don't. Her expression softened, but I didn't let it sway me. What I feel for you now isn't hatred or love. It's indifference. And that's what freedom feels like, Sophia. I'm finally free of you, of us, of everything you made me carry. I hope one day you find whatever it is you're looking for, but I won't be a part of it. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came. For the first time, Sophia had nothing to say. I turned and walked out of the courtroom, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. As I stepped outside, the air hit me like a breath of fresh life. Claire was waiting for me, her usual composed demeanor slightly softened by a small smile. It's done, she said simply. It is, I replied, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of those words. It was done. Over. Finished. We walked down the courthouse steps together, and I couldn't help but notice how much lighter I felt. The world seemed brighter, the air crisper. Even the sound of the city around me felt more alive. Claire stopped at the curb, turning to me. You did well, Ryan. You handled this with dignity, and that's not something everyone can say. Thanks, Claire, I said. For everything. She nodded and gave me a quick handshake before heading off, leaving me to stand there, alone but not lonely. I took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. The future stretched out before me, a blank canvas waiting to be filled. There would be challenges, sure. Healing wasn't an overnight process. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my life. My choices were my own, and no one could take that from me. As I walked away from the courthouse, I felt a small smile tug at my lips. This wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next. The first few days after the divorce were surreal. It wasn't like I woke up feeling like a new man, free of all the baggage and pain Sophia had left behind. Healing isn't instant. But there was this quiet realization, this understanding that the life I had ahead of me was mine to shape. And that was enough to get me out of bed with a little more purpose each day. The apartment felt different now. Without Sophia's presence, it was quieter, emptier, sure, but it wasn't the hollow kind of emptiness. It was the good kind, the kind that left room to breathe. I started to see the space as a blank slate, just like my life. I spent my first weekend post-divorce redecorating. Nothing drastic. I didn't have the budget for that yet, but enough to make the place feel like home again. I moved the couch to a new spot, replaced the garish paintings Sophia had insisted on with my own sketches, and swapped out the heavy curtains for something lighter. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The first night I sat down in my new apartment, something clicked. I looked around and realized this wasn't just a place to sleep anymore. It was a symbol of what I'd reclaimed. Sophia had tried to take it, just like she tried to take everything else. But she failed. And now, this space was a reflection of me, not her. Work was another area where I felt the shift. Without the constant stress of Sophia's demands and manipulation hanging over me, I found myself focusing better. My productivity shot up, and my boss noticed. One day, he pulled me aside and said, "Ryan, you seem sharper lately. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." That conversation led to an opportunity, a promotion, something I never would have had the energy or confidence to pursue while I was stuck in Sophia's shadow. It wasn't just about the extra money. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of more than being the man she'd made me believe I was. But the biggest change came in how I viewed myself. For years, I'd let Sophia's words define me. "You're not enough. You're a failure. You're just a workhorse." Those phrases had played on a loop in my mind for so long that I'd started to believe them. Not anymore. Every step I took toward rebuilding my life, whether it was redecorating, working harder, or simply spending time with friends, was like a hammer chipping away at those lies. I wasn't a workhorse. I was a man who had endured, survived, and come out stronger on the other side. One day, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, shirtless, looking at the scars and calluses Sophia had once mocked. But instead of seeing flaws, I saw stories. I saw the years of hard work that had kept us afloat, the sacrifices I'd made, and the strength it had taken to walk away. Those marks weren't signs of failure. They were badges of resilience. The calls and texts from Sophia started about 2 weeks after the final hearing. At first, they were cold and transactional, questions about when she could pick up the last of her things. Then they became something else. "Ryan, I've been thinking a lot about us," one text read. "Can we talk?" I didn't respond. What was there to talk about? She'd made her choice and I'd made mine. There was no going back. Another message came a few days later. "I miss you. Maybe we rush things." This one made me laugh. Not out of cruelty, but because of how predictable it was. Sophia had spent years taking me for granted, assuming I'd always be there. And now that she realized she'd been wrong, she wanted a do-over. But I wasn't the same Ryan she'd walked all over. I didn't need her validation anymore. I didn't need her at all. Instead of replying, I blocked her number. That act, as simple as it was, felt like closing the door on a chapter of my life I never wanted to revisit. One evening, as I sat on the couch sketching, I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the humiliation, the fight to reclaim what was mine. It had been a storm, no doubt about it. But storms clear the air, and in their aftermath, things grow. I'd grown. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. I wasn't defined by Sophia's insults or her betrayal. I was defined by what I'd done in response, how I'd stood my ground, fought for myself, and come out stronger. As I set my sketch pad aside and looked out at the city lights through my newly hung curtains, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was my life now, simple, quiet, and entirely mine. And for the first time, that was more than enough.